Thank you. Can we get the giant head of Nick Bloom up on the screen, please? There is the giant head of Nick Bloom looming over all of us. Welcome. This is a panel about research experiments and what people are learning from real-world challenges around distributed work. And I am thrilled to be up here along with Annie Dean, VP of Team Anywhere at Atlassian, who you heard from hopefully early this morning if you tuned in. Nick didn't because Nick was asleep. It was 8 hours ago, and Nick's in California. Holly May, Chief People Officer at Datavant, which she recently left, but a very experienced Chief People Officer, and the giant head of Nick Bloom, Stanford professor and remote work specialist. Today we're going to focus on the changing nature of leadership in the workplace. Annie and Holly come from different team perspectives on this in terms of workplace leadership and people leadership. Two of the three legs of a giant stool, along with our friends in IT, that have to actually support all of our teams that are working in more flexible and more distributed ways. And so between them and Nick, who's done tons of research that I'm sure a lot of you have read around remote work and what's working and what's not, we're going to get into a lot of questions. But I'm going to start off with an icebreaker, and no commentary on it, and there's going to be a little bit of audience participation in this one because y'all need to wake up. So raise your hand if you agree with the following statements. Are you cool with walking meetings? Walking meetings. Okay, that's a pretty easy one. How about it's okay to be camera off during a video meeting? A little more mixed, a little bit more mixed. We're going to make it harder. Waving at the end of a video call.
Totally.
Okay, all right. It's okay. We all do it. All right, the hardest one. Is it okay to eat during a meeting with your camera on? All right. Nick, did your hand ever go up? Oh, we should be able to hear Nick. It'd be really cool if we could hear Nick. Hold on,
Sorry,
Nick. There you are.
Now?
Yes.
Here we go.
We can hear you now.
I tried to start every day without forgetting to unmute, but obviously I've failed already at 8 a.m. here.
Welcome. So let me dive into it with a few questions. A lot of the times the headlines feel like a battle between people who want to go backwards, back to the way things worked, especially for them, 2019 and before, and a lot of us who are trying to evolve into better ways of working, redesigning the way that they're working. You guys are on the sort of front lines in this in a lot of different ways, and I'd just like you to each share one thing that you've learned over the course of the past year about what drives organizational performance. And I'll kick it to Annie first, and then I'll make my way around.
I think it's interesting. A lot of the big puzzle pieces have been figured out over the past 3 years. So when I talked this morning, I said, companies are figuring out a new way to connect through kind of connection gathering programs and on-sites. Companies are figuring out a new way to design teams through time zones. They're figuring out the way to organize offices. All these things are kind of coming together. But I think the place where we don't have consensus is about how work should happen. And one of the things that I've noticed is the faster adoption of good working practices for teams that are working across distances. And we heard that in our last panel, too. My ears really perked up from behind stage when I heard that teams who are distributed are adopting AI faster. So I really do think that working in this way is an accelerant to making us work in a more productive, kind of ushering in a new era of work that is fundamentally more creative and kind of leaves the busy work and the work about work to the places where those things should happen, which are in AI and other automated and online tools. So I think that's really the next big wave of organizational effectiveness as I see it.
Makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you can't figure out how to adopt remote work and ways of working more flexibly, then adopting new tools and technology. I used to joke, I was at Slack for a while. If you can't figure out how to use Slack, figuring out how to use generative AI tools is going to also probably be a little outside your grasp.
Right.
Holly, what do you think? What have you learned over the course of this year?
I think one of the things I've learned recently is that organizations are really resilient and no single person is truly indispensable. And in the context of a really small organization, 10, 20, 50-person startup, it's really easy to think if this one person leaves, they have all the institutional knowledge, they have all the customer contacts, we're going to be toast if they leave. And yet organizations truly can get past that. And on the other side of the spectrum, if you're in a big organization, you might think this one leader is, they represent this whole part of the business or this whole customer or this whole industry, and everything's going to fall down if this one leader leaves. Oh my goodness, they've resigned. Now what? And it turns out that organizations and teams truly are resilient, and no single person, no matter how important we think we are or we think they are, will make or break the difference. And I think that's reassuring as a team, as a leader. If someone on your team decides to move on, that you're not in that much trouble, your organization will keep going in their absence. And as someone thinking about leaving, that nothing will burn down just because you decide to leave the organization.
Yeah. There's also an interesting maybe corollary to that, which is the bigger the organization, the harder it is to make it change, because it's a bit like shifting a battleship. That's why we did that enterprise day yesterday with larger companies that have sometimes a harder time than smaller, more nimble organizations going out there. Nick, what have you learned in the past year?
First of all, I'm slightly conscious of being like, Holly kindly sent me a photo. I'm like a 20-foot high head. So I think you can all probably see my the scar where I fell off the climbing structure in 3rd grade. And probably, I'm like nervous, you can see my bad British teeth. So I'll probably talk like this for the rest of the day. So I wanted to say, I want to focus, I know there's a bunch of managers and folks out there trying to make the case for more remote work to CEOs. I want to say, I would focus on profitability, not productivity. So why don't I say why? So one thing is productivity is actually damn hard to measure. It's, a very squishy concept. You're talking about short run, long run. The second more important thing is firms should care about profitability. So why do I raise this? I often hear people kind of beating up on fully remote in particular and saying, well, this productivity or this downside or that downside. You can debate that, and we'll come on to that later. But it has an enormous upside, which it saves a vast amount of money. You have to pay for offices, and you can hire talent nationally or globally. And so it's much easier to make the case that fully remote is extremely profitable. So I try and shift the case to that, because that's ultimately what the business should care about, and away from discussion of this squishy productivity thing.
There's been a great thread throughout the day of productivity as a word that's nearly impossible to define and figure out, but it gets thrown around all the time. I want to switch gears a little bit, because we've got a people leader and a workplace leader here with us, but the role of the people leader has really changed a lot. It's become a lot more challenging, it's grown in its importance, and even the nature of the title itself has changed from human resources to people in a lot of organizations. Nick, you actually did some recent research on this in terms of sort of the level of presence of chief people officers and other folks in the C-suite. What did you guys find?
Yes, totally. So, from a number of conversations, including with Annie, Holly, Cara, others, I got the sense that, look, HR has become just a much bigger deal. And so we wanted to look at it empirically. So what we did is we got what's called the DEF 14A statements from the S&P 1500 public listed firms. So these are the largest 1,500 public listed US firms. Every year, for the SEC, they put out who are their top 5 execs. You always have the CEO, the CFO. The question is, who are the other 3? Who are the other 3 people that companies have said are the most important execs? We have this data back to 1992. What you see is the share of folks that are in HR back in 1992 is tiny. It's about 0.5%. But over time, it's just gone up, 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 up. And in fact, if anything, the slope has started to pick up. So in the most recent data we had in 2022, it was 13%, and it's rising fast. And I think that's a very graphical, numeric, data-driven way of saying HR has just become a hugely important role for companies. And it's become one of the top 5 roles in, increasing now towards about a third or a quarter of companies in the US. I'll stop now. I'm not the expert on what's going on. I just see it very clearly in the data that it's rising in importance.
It's kind of one of those great good news, bad news. Like, good news is it's growing like crazy. Bad news is it's still 16% of companies that have a chief people officer in their top 5. Holly, you've lived through this. The changes in people leadership over the past few years, what's it been like?
Yeah, I think 2020 was a really watershed year for people in the CHRO or CPO or broadly in the people or HR function. But I think the the trend has been going on a lot further. If you'll give me 20 seconds for a brief detour into the history of HR. I'm a historian, Nick is an economist. If we go back to the Industrial Revolution, we're here in Europe, that was really when it became we needed laborers in factories to run mills, and nobody specialized in that domain. It was just get people to do the work and make sure they don't die and then send them home. And jumping forward 100 years, you ended up with, in much of corporate offices, a door in the basement called personnel. Personnel was the paperwork department. It's the hire and fire people compliantly, and someone might call us to verify employment, someone might sue us and ask us to open up the file cabinet and take out the folders of paper. But personnel was ultimately a compliance and paperwork administrative function. And then we moved forward into a role of slightly more strategic HR, and I would say in probably the 2000s, led by Laszlo Bock at Google and many other thinkers that really said, HR has been for 100 years a compliance function. It's been a function about hiring and firing and documenting and avoiding getting sued, right? And then we started to pivot that towards people, the function name, people success or people operations, people experience, different flavors of that, where you really localize the attention on employees. Talent is an asset, not talent is a cost. And we've seen a huge focus on strategic workplace experience, on talent strategy as a concept. Who should we hire and why? On building across differences, whether that's geography or time zones or demographic differences, and a lot more emphasis on compensation strategy. And a lot of this amplified around 2020, where we had to tackle COVID. The amount of times I checked the OSHA websites for the regulations was ridiculous, and I'm not an attorney. Where we had to tackle the role of social justice issues coming into the workplace and what is the right way to think about that and not think about that, and when to speak and not to speak on that. And then, of course, being distributed and remote and saying, take your laptop home on Friday. We don't know what next week looks like in March of 2020. So I think these skill sets and the tools and the expectations have changed massively. So I'm glad in Nick's research that it's starting to show a bit more prestige and resources coming into that function.
It makes a lot of sense because if you think about it, talent is a competitive advantage in companies these days, right? All the companies that you represent are dependent on the intellectual property that gets created, the creativity, the complex work that gets done. Yeah. And so that means that you've got to actually think about talent as an advantage, and you've got to support them. And it's just such a different world these days with so many different challenges.
Yeah.
Annie, you come at this from a different perspective, and Atlassian does too. Like the transformation role sits with Workplace, which you also own,
right,
along with a small team of PhDs.
Yeah.
How have you guys actually positioned this, and how has that worked from your perspective?
It's interesting because I've been deep into HR organizations, but always as an outsider. First selling in as a startup founder, and then my role when I was the head of remote at Facebook was also in the people organization. At Atlassian, interestingly, it started out in the COO org, and then moved into the CAO org, which is where people lives. And the functions that I oversee are our real estate and workplace experience organizations. I also oversee a research organization called the Team Anywhere Lab that you heard about this morning, thus the PhDs. And I always say that there's no way forward without doing a lot of research to figure out what problems we really need to solve. So it's always been important to me in all of the different ways I've played this role to have access to smart research. I also oversee a storytelling function. So we figure out kind of how to tell our story. Externally influences internally is always something that I see. And of course, having a piece of the external conversation is a great opportunity for Atlassian's business in particular, given that we're in the business of connecting people. And then I also have an org effectiveness group. So this is kind of the management, the programmatic management of things like locations, ways of working, onboarding, and connection. And those things are not all fully baked out programs. Of course, onboarding is, and our connections programming is. But oftentimes it's really just about wrangling cross-functional partners and trying to get a distributed perspective into the mix, but in a structured way. So I like to think of myself almost as the GM of distributed work, really thinking about it from a product lens and how to continuously improve it over time. But it's never a natural fit. at, kind of anywhere in the organization, because it is transformative by nature. And I would say the most important thing is to be having CEO level stakeholdership and a very close and aligned relationship with the key executives on the executive team, because without that, it's just really not possible to drive forward transformation.
Yeah, and you guys are making pretty sizable investments. That was one of
Right.
the themes that came out of yesterday's conversations too. If you look at companies like Atlassian, we had Zillow, we had Mr. Cooper, which is a 12,000 person mortgage services company in the US. All of these companies that are actually out there leading are not just setting up a policy and setting and forgetting. They're
Right.
actually continually investing behind learning and kind of have an attitude of we're never done, right?
Right.
You got to like lose the complacency around this.
Exactly.
But if you don't invest, you're not going to get better
Right.
on these things, which is great to see. Last year at this, I gave a talk, and at the end of it, Liam Martin was interviewing me, and I gave a little tirade about why I hate the word remote, which is kind of fun when you're at a thing called running remote. But there are terms like remote that get used all the time, and the term hybrid too. Annie, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah.
What terms should we be using
Yes.
and why?
I think it's really difficult to try to explain to people how place doesn't matter by using terminology that's rooted in place. And so it's been really important to me to find terminology that describes what's actually happening. So what do I mean by that? Remote to me is a term that describes an employee's relationship to an office, which is why we say 40% of Atlassians are remote, because they can't access an office within a 2-hour commute. However, we say that 100% of Atlassians are distributed, because distributed work to me is the act of working on the internet. It describes how work happens. It captures the idea that work can happen in any place at any time. And one of the things that I think is really important for people to see is that every single employee at a company at scale, at a global company, is a distributed worker. Because when you're not working side to side in front of a whiteboard, you're working on the internet. And I want people to understand and situate themselves in a problem that is a large-scale problem that we can solve together. I don't like the word hybrid, although I admit that it exists and has a place. To me, the word hybrid means that employees are partially organizing themselves. Again, it defines the employee based on the office. So what time are they spending in the office versus outside of the office? But in reality, the system should be an online-first system. And, attending in person from time to time, that makes a lot of sense. But organizing a company around being a hybrid structure is, to me, like Facebook saying in 2012 before their IPO that we're going to be mobile partly first. And that just doesn't resonate with me. We've got to have a strategy that makes sense.
That's great. Holly, what works for you? What resonates for you?
I was, before COVID, I'd never worked remotely. I'd always been in an office, and I was not super keen on the concept. And then I came back from parental leave in March of 2020 with the focus of figure out how we're going to be remote. So I entered it with a pretty negative reaction, and I had a complete 180, and I'm now a big advocate for the concept. And actually, Annie influenced me several months ago with what she just said about the phrase distributed, and really pivoting it to how does work happen and where are the humans, not where are the humans relative to HQ. So I would co-sign what we just heard from Annie about distributed. And I've taken that word for a test drive in some random conversations, not with folks like this in the room, but random people next to me at the airport or the train station. And I've really seen folks pivot in their thinking to saying distributed. That really does change it for me. It's not just I hear remote and I think people in their socks working from home, not really doing anything. And so I think for the folks who are not like-minded, like all of us in the room, distributed may actually open up their willingness to think about this topic where they may have a negative view of the word remote.
And we're still stuck with these descriptive terms that you still have to use, like 40% of Atlassians are remote because they don't have access to an office, and hybrid, which can describe to sometimes the number of days. Nick, you've done had a lot of conversations with organizations, and you and I both work with like the Flex Index data, which shows how 8,000 companies categorize their policies. But when you think about like the more fixed hybrid structures, people that are doing the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, everybody be in the office, do you think that's a permanent solution, or where do we head from here?
Great. So I'll make a couple of comments. One is on terminology. Having worked on this for 20 years, it's amazing how it changes. So pre-pandemic, it used to be telecommuting. Jack Niller's coined that term in 1973, and that has totally died. Pre-pandemic, work from home, basically, and when I talk to people, they'd think of what's called now, I guess, fully remote. There was really hybrid. The word didn't exist. Actually, we've been scraping media, newspapers and stuff, and it really was a 2020 word. So I don't have strong views on it. I think for me, the main thing is at least people understand what we're each saying. So the worst thing is, we use different words. In terms of what we're seeing, I'm going to go back. There's a bit Quentin Tarantino. Everything's going to wrap in on itself. I'm going to go back to what Holly said earlier, which is it's amazing. If you look at the history of economics, you see major changes take decades to run through. So think of the steam engine, the electric motor, the personal computer, air conditioning, refrigeration and food supply. These things take decades. The shift to, the 5-6x increase in remote working is huge. It's just, I think it's the biggest change to labor markets and the way companies operate probably since World War II. And my guess is we're 5 years in to a 10, 15 year transition, and it's just hard and it takes a while. What I see in the data, and you mentioned Flex, and I'm also going to cite some of the Cadence desk booking data as well, is basically companies, when they're operating at least hybrid, really want people in just to see each other. So no one wants people in just to sit at the desk. That seems pointless. You can sit at the desk at home. So it's all about getting people in on the same days. It doesn't need to be the same day across teams, so they don't work together, obviously across companies. Typically what I see most of is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Probably second is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And then third is everything else. I mean, there's just such a mix out there. But, it's a real Wild West. The other thought I have to say is when I talk to companies that say they have people coming in 1 day a week, it's not obvious you need an office at all. At the point you're only coming in 1 day a week, why not get rid of the office and then, do events and retreats and, mix it up a bit. There's a company called Strava, actually, that oddly enough was founded by Michael Horvath, that used to be one of my colleagues at Stanford in the economics department. So economists rarely found anything, but he's like a total exception. And they said they've kept their headquarters in San Francisco, but he said in Denver, we weren't coming in that much. So they just got rid of the office and have folks, book days, and he seemed very happy with it.
A lot of shifts going on in that in terms of how people are rethinking, especially the more distributed your organization gets. And let's face it, most large companies are actually way more distributed post-pandemic than they were before. You've also got to support the needs of those teams that are more far-flung. So when Annie and Atlassian are thinking about getting people together 3 or 4 times a year, you got to think about more locations in order to support people who are more spread out when they're doing that. So when I started this off and I did the little, let's start off with easy questions and let's make it harder with the exercise, the questions get harder from here. Nick, last August, and it's been a year since running remote, so last August there was a Fortune headline that said something to the effect of, the world's biggest remote work expert says it's not productive. So tons of headlines off of one paper that you wrote, had your name on, that cited a bunch of other studies. I would just love, you and I have talked about this 10 times since then, but would love to have you opine upon that Fortune headline and whether or not remote work is truly less productive based on those studies.
Yeah, I'm realizing
no
right now
problem.
The advantage of being remote is I can hide, so I can just do this, and then and I can check if is anyone there. Okay, so I have to say, I don't know if anyone noticed in academic papers, I actually changed it in the published version. So it turned out to be massively misleading. So why don't I just explain what went on and then, so there are a number of studies. There's about 5, 6 at that point that looked at fully remote. One of them was mine that I did that was found it was plus 13%, but there are others that were like minus 20, minus 30. We kind of, stupidly took the average across those studies and put that number there. Why is that problematic? And why do we remove it in the final published paper? 2 reasons. One is it turns out how effective remote is depends critically on how well managed it is. And maybe that seems obvious, but the really big negative numbers were people that rushed home early on in the pandemic. It was chaos and people were all over the place, and not surprisingly, it fell apart. The big positive numbers were well-run organizations, looking at Annie, but I'm pretty sure Atlassian does a fantastic job with this, for example. So one was, you're not the average. You can critically depend this. The other thing is a more nerdy academic problem, which is, as an academic, when you run a study like that, you need to get it published, which means you need to have good data, which basically means you tend to do randomized control trials in organizations that produce lots of data. Think call centers, data entry, they're not very representative. And to make it even more obvious, imagine 3 of my PhD students rush out and do randomized control trials in call centers. You now go from 6 studies to 9, but now you're averaging over 3 extra call centers, and that changes the average. So looking at just published studies is not that useful. So in the end, we dropped that. And I think my takeaway is, 1, is it depends critically on how well you manage it. And 2, ultimately, profit is actually the better metric. So in the paper, we say, look at profitability, because that's what matters most.
Nick, on behalf of all of the Running Remote community, we accept your ducking.
So I don't have to hide him.
Thanks on that one. This is still something that comes up in every executive conversation that I have. And Holly, I know you've heard this too, which is, I had a senior executive say to me fairly recently, I don't know that they're walking their dog at home 4 hours a day, but if they're in the office, I know they're not walking their dog 4 hours a day. How do we get past this whole need to get people into an office to ensure they're working?
Such a big question for such a short amount of time. I think that what Nick was saying was how is it managed is massively important, and I think that starts with tone from the top. Does your CEO, whomever he or she is, and the senior leadership team actually, like, not what do they say, but like actually embrace a distributed workplace environment? And if they are saying that they do, but they're not showing that they do, you know, you've got a challenge to solve there. But I think tone comes from the top, and so having that leadership buy-in really matters. Do you have an HQ location where your CEO goes on a regular basis and expects people to walk the hall, right? Like, management by walking around is not taught today, right? That's not how you grow up to be a leader today. That's how people grew up to be leaders in the past and in very, very large organizations. And if you have a CEO that prefers management by walking around, you're never really going to get away from his or her pull to the office. So that leadership influence, leadership buy-in is so critical. And I think as employees or leaders at a company trying to achieve that, it really starts with bringing principles, bringing data, and bringing case studies to say this is what other places are doing, this is how things are happening at a much, much smaller scale. When we unexpectedly went from office-based in Silicon Valley to working from home at the start of COVID, like many organizations and many folks here, I turned to the GitLab handbook. And it wasn't the only playbook, but it was an extremely helpful example of other people who had thought about it and had principles and had activities. And I think that really got our organization through that transition. But I'd say executive buy-in, and if you don't have it yet, how do you get it? You get it with data, with influence, and with case studies. And you don't get it by just banging your hand on the table saying this is what the labor force wants or this is what employees expect. I think anchoring it in employee happiness is the worst way to go about this.
Yeah. That's a great point. Annie, in the prep session that we were doing for this, you said the office is not a management vehicle.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I guess it's basically what Holly's saying as well, where there is a way of managing a company in a lot of different facets where the office is a dependency for those management practices. So you're managing people by walking around. You are organizing your teams by a city. You are organizing your teams by floor. You really are building a set of considerations that are optimizing for the way a group of people organizes itself by a physical building. And a lot of those behaviors persist. That's one of the biggest challenges here. So when I say that we're moving to an online versus office first system, it means that we're orienting towards a reality where the online world is how we organize ourselves. And when you start to orient yourself to that online first system, the way that you manage is really different. You definitely don't manage by walking around, but you manage by having a strong sense of empathy, by having really clear, visible goals, by having innovative working practices, by having a strong culture of performance management, by having clear principles about how you organize and set your culture as a company. And these are all really different ways, because it used to be that these things happened organically just by being in the same room as one another. So I think it's a really significant shift for people to make. And, you know, I ask myself the question all of the time, why is this a 10 to 15 year transformation? Why isn't it happening as quickly as we would expect it to? And the reality is that so much of this is the lived experience and identity of our class of leaders. And so the only way to overcome that is through data and alternative and principled solutions. But even those are not convincing to some people who have an identity that can't be shaken from this office-first construct. And that's okay, because ultimately the market will redefine that opportunity for companies. And I do think that 1,000% the worst way to go at this is employee preference. But I also think it's really sad because the opportunity that it creates for people is profound. I think this is the biggest lever for gender equality that we have experienced in our lifetime. And it makes me really sad that CEOs' personal relationship to office-based management principles is more important than that. So I do wish that we can get to a place in the conversation where that comparison can be made effectively, but we'll get there over time.
I had a crew of chief financial officers last spring in a group, all men. And one of them started, and the next one continued. I'm coming back 4 days a week. I'm coming back 4 days a week. I'm coming back 5 days a week, getting tougher. And it was the second to last one who said, I am the primary caregiver for my kids. I'm not coming back. And the fact that he was the primary caregiver was a rarity in that audience, right? But often it's you forget the decision you're making has detrimental impacts because you have a lot of power in that seat on people who don't have the same setup. They don't have not only the office where they can close the door, but they don't have the situation at home, let alone, partner who's a caregiver or the nanny or other things like that too.
Right.
And it's a real challenge. One of the other things that the Atlassian study put out too is back to that goals issue, right? One of the key conversations is always not about employee preference, but like what outcomes are we trying to drive? Right. And do you even know what your goals are in the first place? And I think it was like 87% of executives said that people within the same organization don't even know and understand what the broader set of goals are. If you can't tell me what your goals are and the outcomes you're trying to drive, then we don't need to talk about productivity. We need to talk about how do we get aligned on what we're trying to do in the first place.
Right.
What, for any of you, jump ball, like what hinders productivity in a distributed environment? Because I've also seen organizations where it seems like it's just not quite working the right way. What's holding people back?
In my experience, I'd say lack of norms, lack of clarity of how to do things. And I'll give an example. My lived experience involves merging two organizations, a small knowledge worker tech startup with a large distributed services organization with people in every zip code, mostly making under $20 an hour. And those two organizations had extremely different operating models. Both organizations had a history of setting goals, right? You talk to the leadership team of the small tech company where I came from, you talk to the leadership team of the large services organization. We all set goals. That felt like common ground. But when we actually, after the transaction closed, got into it, how do you set goals? The timeline, is it annual? Is it quarterly? Is it monthly? Is it weekly? Is it a group consensus? Or is it executive top-down? Do we aim for stretch goals, OKRs, and ambitious goals to help us pull forward? Or do we aim for safety goals, like sandbagging and making sure you definitely hit it so the quarterly report is positive? Those are all examples of ways of doing it differently. And I think all aspects of distributed work if you don't clarify what are the rules of the road, like what are the principles and the norms for how we communicate, how we train, how we onboard, how we set goals, how we use computers, how we use technology, I think it all kind of falls down. And the more tight you can be on clarifying those, it just tells everybody how things work around here.
And I would say that the biggest thing for me, just to put it succinctly, is organizations that are using the office and using meetings as a solution to problems that should not be solved in that format. So way, way, way too many meetings and way, way too many kind of organic, unplanned processes that aren't thoughtful or intentional.
We're in a crisis. What we need is 15 more meetings to talk about the crisis.
Right, exactly.
Nick, observations from you on things that hold people back?
Yeah, I mean, the two related things that I hear, one of them, interestingly, goes back to talking to Marissa Mayer about what happened in Yahoo back in 2013. So one is, it's very related to Annie and Holly's point, which is measuring the right thing. So at one extreme, you can measure inputs. So I'm fully remote. You can measure how many, how quickly I respond to email, how many minutes I'm on the phone, etc. That is, I don't think that's the way to go. There's ways to get around it. My friend says, her company measures keystrokes. So she says when she takes the dog for a walk, she gets her mum to press the space bar. I mean, this isn't the way to go, measuring inputs. What you want to measure is output. So, or achievements or outcomes, or whatever you want to call it. So, for me, for example, that would be research, output, teaching, evaluation, service. So I think that's one key thing. The other theme that's come up a lot actually from companies and particularly execs is claiming there's kind of a problem with mentoring. And I think the issue here is often companies don't reward mentoring. So if you want people to spend time mentoring, it has to be part of their objectives and part of what they're rewarded for. So, years ago, I worked at McKinsey, and as a manager, about 20% of your evaluation is based on mentoring people. And you suddenly felt a strong incentive, I can assure you, to mentor and provide feedback. And you felt like you got rewarded for it. Some law firms I've talked to will be basically rewarding 100% to partners on client billing. And guess what? The partners don't tend to mentor people, and it's harder when they're distributed. So I think achievements, outcomes, and also including mentoring as part of that is really the critical way to go. And it's why, coming back to the earlier discussion on HR is pretty central in this discussion, which is why they've become ever more important.
That's great. One of the things that we touched on just a little while ago was that flexibility disproportionately helps underrepresented groups at work, people who've historically had a harder time. Women more than men, caregivers, people from racial and ethnic minorities, people with different abilities, all the rest of it. But there's also this thing that keeps coming up again and again, which is flexibility in where you work helps knowledge workers. It helps people who are office workers. Holly, you've managed a major, sizable frontline workforce as well as office workers. I have this thing gets tossed at all of us on a regular basis, which is it's somehow unfair. How do you think about fairness in that context?
I think the most unfair in all of this is employees enter a relationship with their employer that is one thing. It is distributed, it is office-based, it is work from home part-time, and then after they join the company, it is changed on them. I think that's kind of the pinnacle, and I've seen that happening. I think that's the pinnacle of unfairness. I think if you're clear on the notion of a job, what is the job? What are the duties? What is it paid? Where is it done? What are the expectations? I think it's not that tricky to just say different jobs have different expectations. We pay software engineers more than salespeople. Not super shocking. We pay call center agents less than we pay salespeople. Not that shocking. If you can just be clear and principled about it. And that's where I think pay transparency and a similar idea of transparency for the job duties and the outcomes that are expected can allow you to get away from the, oh, well, that account manager can work from home, but I'm a customer service rep and I have to come in the office. If you can explain why those jobs are different and then have a path for mobility. What is the path that you can apply for an internal job, and with a different job title or a different job duty, have a different relationship to your place?
I think it's great. And a throwback to Raj Chowdhury, who's still in the audience, who did a discussion this morning about digital twins and some of the things that are starting to play out even in frontline workforces, and the ability to give people flexible schedules instead of flexible locations and other ways of getting at this. Okay, one more spicy one, zone-based compensation. Nick, you've run a couple of LinkedIn polls about the sort of some often hot topic, which is pay bands. Are pay bands a good thing or a bad thing? What are you hearing from executives and from people that you're talking with about that?
This is one of these questions that there's no easy answer. I just tell you how I got onto this. Actually, 2 different exec sessions in Stanford had basically the same problem came up. So I'll tell you the first one. So I had a manager, and she said, look, I run a big remote team right across Europe, and we pay based on country. And she said, one of my star performers is claiming they're in Germany, but they're actually in Spain. And Spain is a lower pay rate. And she said, look, I know it's like kind of obvious, but I'm going to ignore it. I really don't care. He's doing great. Just leave it. She said, the problem was one of my other team members figured out that this person's in the wrong country. And ridiculously, apparently figured it out because on the back of Zoom, they could see the beach. And they're like, that does not look like a German beach. And apparently the beach, it's kind of like crazy. But she said, it created a nightmare for me because what do I do? On the one hand, I ignore it, but then I'm kind of complicit basically in pay fraud. On the other hand, I say to the person, look, you're you're in the wrong place, you've been fraud in the company, we're going to have to, take disciplinary action. I lose my star performer. And, this kick that twice this happened actually in class, and it kicks around the class and there's no easy answer. So the question we surveyed 8,000 Americans in Sway, and we also put it up on LinkedIn, is for fully remote workers. To be clear, this is people who are, fully distributed, whatever word, they're not coming in. They maybe meet once a month or something, but they're not coming in on any regular cadence. Should they be paid either locally, as in like city by city? So San Francisco is a different rate from, say, Jacksonville. Should they be paid country by country, or should they be paid on a global rate? And not sure I have a correct answer, but I tell you, on LinkedIn and on Sway, we got about a third. So it's just all over the place. The other thing is I noticed the data is slowly shifting towards more global, because a lot of companies I talk to are trying to get rid of at least local pay, because they say it's creating a total headache on trying to police where people are. But I'll stop there. And that's exec head problem that comes up in the classroom.
And Annie, you've had to deal with this, I know, too, quite a bit.
Yes, I have had to deal with this, and it's interesting because I think that the feedback that zone-based compensation is difficult to manage is real. For instance, where do you actually break the county line where you go from zone 1 to zone 2? However, I really want to see distributed work succeed and be adopted. And I think a lot of that has to do with it being a good economic proposition that delivers profitability for companies. And, like Nick has been saying, we should be thinking about profitability. And I certainly am looking at my success metrics internally to make sure that I can show that this is a profitable program that delivers the opportunity to reinvest. And I want to be able to do that. So I think that by globalizing pay, we really take that off the table. And I think a lot about how, when I think about compensation going forward in this new model, I think about the world as a flat map, and I think about not being overly horizontally exposed, because we want to be limited to time zone bands. But when you think about the vertical kind of regions on that map, there's a lot of different countries and compensation zones that you can select from in order to build your talent profile. So that gives the company an opportunity to build teams that's optimized for both cost and collaboration. Back in the outsourcing model, you could only optimize for cost. You would have to move quite horizontally, and that would give you a new low-cost zone. But the types of work to be managed and the relationship between those teams is very different, because the working day doesn't overlap whatsoever. So I think there's a better world where you can kind of select into different compensation zones, even within the United States, for instance, is a big territory, and there's lots of opportunity to have different forms of pay. The other thing that I think is interesting, and I'm always, Nick, I'm going to have to take you out to dinner and pick your brain on this soon, after you're done hiding from that study that got misquoted in Fortune. But, one of the things that I think is interesting is that there's this huge opportunity for cities to grow. And I'm taking a very U.S. perspective, so I apologize. But this certainly has global applicability as well. Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities can thrive in this environment. We can see people take their job and bring it to Tulsa or bring it to other places in the United States, and we can see totally different quality of life emerge and a really new, different class of workers that can bring investments to different types of cities. But if you make one globalized pay rate, that incentivization doesn't exist. And you basically impact negatively the affordability of those Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities, which, by the way, people who are not tech workers deserve to have cost savings within. So I find it difficult to take a proposition and say knowledge work has a single globalized payroll and that it can transport anywhere. But the person who raises your children and provides your child care is rooted in that local economy in a different pay structure. So those are the things I can't reconcile. And the two big things that I wish employees understood, or actually I guess there's three things. I'm going to go on a mini tangent. I don't think you can work anywhere. I think you have to make sure that you have a workday overlap with your team. I don't think that pay should be globalized. I think it should be related to the local economy. And digital nomad visas may be great for independent workers, but They don't solve the business tax issues and liability issues and IP protection issues of a major enterprise. So those are the three questions that I get all the time that I'd love to like myth bust and let you all know it's difficult to solve.
Here. Holly, what do you have to add?
Oh, this is great. We could do another 15 minutes on this alone. I think the company I came from had a really strong emphasis in first principles, and I'm going to go back to that and say that there are a lot of different ways to solve what's your compensation strategy and what's your total rewards strategy. And I think being anchored in clear principles that you can tell people is the most important thing, and there are viable ways to get to different answers. Personally, not in my professional space, but personally, I have a really strong view that equal pay for equal work should apply, at least across countries, if not across within a country, if not across countries. I tried to put that into practice, and the notion of our business complexity, it didn't fly. And so we had an environment where, for our knowledge workers, about 20% of our workforce, we ended up splitting by job function. And we took all of our professionals and put them into one of four categories, not by where they lived, but by what kind of work they did. Were they building technology as software engineers and product managers? Were they selling and supporting that technology as account managers and customer success team members? Were they in the classical G&A, finance, legal, IT, HR? And we paid differently in terms of percentile for the average based on those. So we took a totally geography agnostic view and said we're paying for the work being done. If you're a software engineer in San Francisco or in Tulsa or in Jacksonville, Florida, we're paying you as a software engineer because we, the company, value your output regardless of where you're located. Did people leave New York and San Francisco? Absolutely. Were we okay with that? From the business perspective, as a business executive, if they got the work done that we expected them to get done at a high quality and as a good human, I don't really care where you live. Now, with our frontline workforce that shows up in person in locations, we can't do that. And so we had colleagues doing identical work, data entry and call center type work, in Manhattan and in rural upstate New York. And they got paid very, very differently because their work was tied to location. And so we did a pretty traditional and classic location-based pay on a pretty granular level.
Makes a lot of sense. The complexities here are huge. And the bigger the company and the longer standing you are, the more expensive and harder it is to make a lot of these changes happen.
Right.
This will be a competitive dynamic, though, going forward for the next decade. So it's going to be really interesting to see. Let's open it up to questions, please, from the audience. I see at least one hand up back there. I see at least two hands up, 1, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to start auctioning off spots. We got one now. We go 2, 2, 2, 3. We'll run a mic out to someone back there. There's a mic being run, I promise.
Hello.
Hi, Dave.
So, Annie, you didn't call out my tier 20 market of Prince Edward Island. How did you forget that? That's not my question. This might be more for Holly, but for anybody. I was on the phone with my accountant last week, and she mentioned to me that they really leaned into remote, and then they started to find that their new hires were not really officing very well. And so I think that we're experiencing this strange moment in human history where we're redefining what it means to be a social animal. And I would love to know what you guys think about this, like if this is actually a problem that organizations need to be worried about, or if we actually need to redefine socialization. Thoughts?
Yeah, I love this question. And in Barbie, there's a reference to Ken is good at beach. I think there's a notion of like, can young college grad or new worker, like, can they professional? Like what does that mean? And I think that needs to be defined and clarified. Again, going back to what are your principles, what are your norms? When we went from office-based to remote, and again, our labor force is like highly skilled knowledge workers in the Bay Area in San Francisco, we ran a lot of experiments and surveys, and what we found was our recent college grads joining new teams out of college, their first job was with us, really struggled compared to the cohort a year, 2, 3, 4 before them. And our insight came from interns who had been office-based as summer interns, gone back to finish college, then come back to their first year full-time with us. That was post-COVID and distributed. And what we realized was there was a lot of X-factor intangibles that they were not learning. And those interns became leaders of their classes because they had worked in the office and they had this secret knowledge of how people did things and what did it mean. And so what we ended up doing was we unpacked that. We surveyed all of our new hires for probably a year or two to figure out what was working and not. And we did in-person new hire onboarding. So we batched our start dates 3 times a year for software engineers, which was the core of our business. And we said each time we're going to pick a different location, rent out a hotel and ballrooms, et cetera, and do in-person training. We brought some of our veteran employees to those to create the experience of what does it look like to tap someone on a shoulder and figure out what's going on. We did pair programming and all of that. This is hard to scale to thousands of people, right? And when we merged our businesses and this became thousands of new hires every year, we couldn't do it. But I think we identified the experience of a college grad joining the workplace. There's so many things you learn by watching. What does your manager do? What does the big boss do? What time do people come? How do people dress? How do you answer a question? Is it okay to be quiet in a meeting or not? So many other norms that you just didn't see in a virtual environment. We tried to adjust that by creating an in-person onboarding experience. And as we scaled, had to do that more through explicit documentation. I don't mean policies, but I mean like we wrote shit down. Like, please do that. Just that is good for everyone, especially new hires and new employees. Like, how do things work here? What's expected here? And who do you ask if you have questions? And then share that widely.
It's interesting. I co-sign everything you say. We face the same challenges and try to solve in similar ways of creating valuable in-person experiences to allow people with less self-directed awareness about what knowledge they need to acquire, put them in organic environments that they can then acquire it. But I also think it's okay that this is not fully a question about the office and companies solving this problem. I think society is changing, and that's okay and a welcome change. I have a 10-year-old, and a lot of research has recently come out about the anxiety generation and how kids are kind of behind smartphones. And I live in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment in New York City, and it means that my 10-year-old after school is sometimes kind of in his bedroom watching TV. And I think just where are all the third spaces? How are we going to open up our society to create more spaces if we're not in getting this social connection from the office that we used to go to and spend 8 to 10 hours a day in? Where can we go? I just saw somebody on the street in New York, and I was running late to a meeting, and I love working from home, so running to an in-person meeting, I was feeling a little harried, but this guy was stressed, and he had his computer in his hand and a charger, and he was like, there's no internet here. And I'm like, yeah, that's a 24-hour bar. And he was like, where do I go? I need to take a call. And, I couldn't actually come up with a good solution for him because he was clearly visiting. I was like, oh, you go to a hotel? But there should be places where we can go as members of our community. We can watch our kids play. We can have indoor parks. We can have cities that are activated by rich community spaces with art in them. That's the experience that we deserve to have. And I think the office has met that need for a lot of us for a long time, but now we've got to start thinking differently.
I live in San Francisco. It is not as bad as... I live in San Francisco. It's not as bad as everybody says. And there's actually a lot going on that's exactly
San
that.
Francisco is charming.
They're trying to do more programming downtown to try to get people back for a reason that's not work, which actually makes it more vibrant and not feel like this unipolar thing that's happening there.
Yeah.
Nick, you've got 4 kids, if I remember right, and several hundred college students. What's your take on this? All the 100 college students aren't his kids.
Yeah, teaching definitely is something that I think I was thinking about this morning, is best done in person, at least now. That may be different in 20 years from now, but certainly currently, I taught for a year during the pandemic, and, I had my kids at home, and it was not great. In fact, it's funny, and one of my kids was much happier being at home because they found school really stressful, and it was a much better, but one of them was, anyway. So the undergrads definitely didn't like it. I had one funny experience. I was teaching class, and I normally have a 2-hour class, and for during the pandemic year, I split it into 2 1 hours because 1 hour is about as much as you can do on Zoom. And it would do a lot of people talking. It was kind of like therapy, and they'd go around. And at one point, one of the students said, oh, it's been such a hard year. I really find it really depressing. It's so tough. I wish I was back on campus. And then suddenly next door to him, somebody said, no, that's not right. You're having fun. And he suddenly went, oh, sorry, Mum. And it was like, oh, my God, that confirms everything. It's like his mum was sitting next to him listening into, I was like, well, yes, I think you've made the point. That's OK. So Yes, I mean, there are certain things that are just better in person, like undergrad teaching. I give you a fact that's kind of interesting. I polled my undergrad, grad, MBA classes, etc. And those of my undergrads all said basically when they start work, they want to go into the office, typically, 4 days a week. The MBAs and the PhDs who are, much, late 20s, early 30s, who are much more mixed. So some of them are very office-based, some of them are more work from home. One of them, at least, was fantastic. He said, on the terminology, he said, I want to work from home 5 days a week, but I don't actually want to be at home. I want to be a digital nomad. I want to be in Greece. It highlights, I think, as folks, go through their life cycle, the particular, as you mentioned earlier, when they have younger kids, that's a really great time to allow them the flexibility to work from home. If they're 21, 22, they don't have a big apartment, they want to be social, they typically want to go in the office. So I think flexibility is hugely important here.
Yeah, the youngest generation in all of our Future Form data for 3 years running was the least likely to want fully remote and least likely to want 5 days. They're the most likely to want something in the middle for a variety of reasons. Let's take another question. Here, I'm going to do this.
Thank you so much. Do you see impact of distributed work on the gender pay gap? Do we have less gender pay gap in distributed organizations, or is it pretty much the same as in traditional ones?
Nick, I'm excited to hear your answer, but my hypothesis is that the leadership class can be very disrupted on a gender equity basis through distributed work, because the leadership class tends to be knowledge work jobs. I don't think that it has the ability to disrupt the gender pay gap. There are other factors. There are factors like bias. There are different types of jobs. But what I'm most excited about is the leadership gap and getting better representation of women into decision-making and authority in our companies and governments. And that's where I think we're going to see the biggest impact. But Nick and Holly, what do you think?
Nick, why don't you go?
Okay. It's a super interesting question. There's a couple of papers, one at least by Michelle Turtilt, that looks at it, and I think she finds it does narrow the gender pay gap, because you can imagine, for women in particular, they tend to have on average higher home care responsibilities, and it reduces that. I mean, it doesn't get rid of it, but it reduces that. The data I know best, I'm going to do what politicians do. They answer a slightly different question. So it is a great question. I have to say, I'll look into it, but I don't exactly. Actually, this is why this kind of thing is so useful. You get so many research ideas. What I do know is in the US, if you look at work from home, it's relatively gender neutral. So if you look at levels of work from home rates across men and women, it's pretty balanced. What is really interesting is you go out to other countries, particularly developing countries, that's not true. So I heard Raj is there. So Raj and I know Sahani Jalotta, who's a fantastic grad student from Stanford, did a great randomized control trial looking at work from home in India. And she finds there it's massively more beneficial to women than men, because A, there's, harassment risk when you're traveling around, and B, there's much, bigger problems of sexism in the workplace. I actually spoke to some folks in Afghanistan. There were NGOs that said the Taliban had banned women working. So the only way in Afghanistan that women could work in these NGOs was to do it fully remotely. So it is a really interesting question. It seems to be in developing countries, there's an enormous gender twist. It's less clear how much is there in the US and say Northern Europe.
I'll add one tiny comment to that, which is that if organizations do embrace formally being distributed, like from their leadership teams and their cultures, one of the pieces of work in a people function or an HR function is what does that mean for our pay? And different states and countries have different pay transparency laws. And so if you go down the path of embracing a distributed workforce, it then has a follow-on set of work that requires a degree of structure and clarity on compensation philosophy. And so if you haven't done that work, depending on your scale or maturity, then the choice to become, I have to comply with New York and California state laws about pay transparency, can be the prod that gets organizations to be more mature on this.
With that, I'm going to wrap it here because we're under a minute. All three of these are amazingly wonderful human beings, as well as being deep experts. So please follow them on LinkedIn and online if you're not already. Thank you very much, Annie, Holly, and Nick, for joining us here today.